Welcome, everybody, to the debut episode of Talkin Thrones, the weekly recap show where we break down the Goliath that was Game of Thrones week by week, episode by episode. Our debut episode is, of course, entitled Winter is Coming. I am Dom the Movie Nerd, and my co-host for tonight, Professor Pat Huber. Pat, you got anything to say?
Yeah, Dom, I know you've been doing a lot of research, and boy, I'm already ready to hibernate. Oh, oh, man, you know.
Oh, my God. We'll see you guys in the flip. Talkin Thrones. Well, after that introduction, welcome everybody. We're here in the latest slew of kind of talking about old TV shows that were awesome that kind of happened during the pandemic. We are here with our debut episode of Talkin Thrones. Hopefully copyright notwithstanding. Pat, how's it going, man?
Oh, it's going great. Like, for the most part,
For the most part.
well, this past week I did watch the first episode of Game of Thrones, and let me tell you,
Wow, tell us how you really feel before we even actually start to break it down.
No, it's pretty much as I remembered it. That's all.
Take that for what you will, people. So yeah, basically, premise of this show is that, look, I mean, everyone knows we all got burned by the finale 2 years ago, and right now, roughly, we're shaping up to be right around the time, roughly 2 years ago, that god-awful last season debuted. But I wanted to, after, obviously Steve Schreiber and Michael Imperioli are doing the Talkin' Sopranos podcast, and The Ringer did the Way Down to the Hole podcast where they covered every episode of The Wire, and I kind of wanted to get to the next thing before somebody else did, so that's why I decided to reach out to Pat and be like, hey, let's talk about Game of Thrones again, because it's kind of interesting how this show was ultimately the epicenter of kind of like monoculture, water cooler, whatever kind of terminology you want to use as far as like peak TV goes. For roughly 10 years, it was the dominant of the conversation, right? After Breaking Bad kind of ended, right? Game of Thrones officially took over. It kind of pushed every other show to the side, kind of. And then the last season comes out, screws the pooch, and then just disappears. And we're like not talking about it. I mean, obviously, again, we had a whole year with a pandemic where just no movies, but it's definitely interesting as far as that goes. So I guess kind of the purpose of this show is going to be to kind of obviously in breaking down each episode is just going to kind of be to figure out what happened overall, on the road to the finale, and in this premiere, again, we're going to be talking about the episode. We're going to be talking about, kind of the origin of what led to the show's inception. We're going to be talking about the man himself, George R.R. Martin, and we're going to talk about some other cool features as far as we'll talk about a focus character of each episode. We'll talk about some elements of the universe, or as we like to say, as we coined on this show, the GOTchaverse. And at the end, we'll take some comments from you guys, the people who are graciously listening. We're already having a ton of comments already, which is I love. Shout out to Eric Thorpe and Joe Chiarulli. But do me a favor, guys. So I know this is going to be difficult. I know, but save the comments and any questions that you have for the end, because we're going to have a little bit of a segment for for that end topic. But Pat, overall, I guess to start this off, I don't know, break down when did you first notice Game of Thrones? Did you read the books at all? What was it that kind of got you into the show?
All right, so for the most part, my story starts when I was, on my deathbed. No, no, I was.
Wow, we're already starting.
I was basically extremely sick, and I was, visiting, home, and my brother was there, and I was telling him about being in Manhattan and seeing this Game of Thrones, basically. Set up this giant, iron throne that was in the middle of Columbus Circle. And it was the big promo for the next season 2. Season 2 is coming, so to speak. And he was like, have you even seen Game of Thrones? And I was like, no, not at all. I just seen a giant throne in the middle of this city. And so he was like, well, you're not doing anything. You've basically been sitting on that couch for a couple hours now. Why don't I just throw on the first season? and that was my introduction. So,
Interesting. Interesting.
I basically binged the first season when I was, down and out. And like I alluded to, let's just say there was a couple snooze breaks with the first
Yep.
couple episodes.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's not it's interesting, I guess, kind of when I talk to people about it, and now everyone that's watched it, right? They literally they can't put it down, right? They seem like they have to like binge episode after episode after episode. And I guess what's fascinating is, again, just like the amount of people who were like hardcore Game of Thrones fans while it was on, and they would talk about everything and they would theorize about everything. And then just when the last season came out, it just, you know what it was about the last season? It was that it burned people. It did that kind of, it broke kind of one of those cardinal rules that we have with media, specifically with kind of like fan based, like big IP property medias, which is that it both basically made the fans and kind of all their investment that they put into it feel irrelevant, while also like kind of just taking all the incredible story elements that made this such a compelling watch throughout the years and just literally just threw that out the window.
Yeah, if we're gonna kind of guess about like the arc of this series, I would say like, people when they first started watching it, it sort of like the idea of, there's characters with plot armor and like they're just never gonna die, etc. And season one, there's definitely the definitive moment where
Right.
it spices up, and
Yes.
then it's like, some sickly guy on a couch is like, whoa. like there is a moment where you get
Wonder who you
engaged.
could be referring to in that scenario.
Yeah. So, and so now, at that particular moment, in season one, you're basically talking about anything can happen,
Right.
and you're sort of like ready for it. What corner are they going to write themselves into that leads to some unexpected twist of characters that you thought were safe? And
Right.
I think setting that tone, like the slow build up to that tone, in retrospect, is very smart. But at the same time, the first
It's a
couple
slippery
episodes,
slope as far as that goes, because then you start to get into
yeah,
what are we getting into, which I've talked about a lot, like just killing off characters for shock value's sake, which we'll get into that as far as like as the show goes on, and as far as like
yeah.
different certain moments as far as the creators go, and kind of like where the emphasis was maybe when the show started versus as the show went on overall. But I guess to just kind of kick this off, right? So talk about we're going to talk about to kind of start it off, which is just the kind of the origin of this whole thing, right? So you got George R.R. Martin, obviously, famously now well known primarily for this series, but surprise, surprise, obviously, Game of Thrones, or A Song of Ice and Fire, the series as it was known, was not the first thing that he wrote. He was already actually a successful fantasy and sci-fi writer, having published his first short story in 1971 and his first novel in 1977. And not only that, but the show was also not his first time working in Hollywood. He had been working actually in Hollywood as a writer throughout the mid-'80s, working principally on the revival of The Twilight Zone and on Beauty and the Beast. Pat, I don't know if you could like shed any light on that show, because I'm the only Beauty and the Beast that I was familiar with besides the Disney property was the CW show that's on,
Geez.
and I refuse to watch anything associated with them. So
Listen, I totally grew up in the 90s. So when you put Beauty and the Beast in the notes, I was like, oh, that Disney movie. And when you told me it was not
it
that
was
Beauty and the
not
Beast,
that.
you
We
know,
were
I
utterly
wasn't sure.
confused.
The in terms of George R.R. Martin, the one thing I know, and I don't know if you've heard this, but I've heard that he's writes in Vim, a command line writing program.
I did
Have
not
you
know
heard
that, but then again, I if it's not a screenwriting software program, I assume that just every author just used Microsoft Word, like most
Yeah,
people.
no, I think he's like old school computer, savvy. So using those kind of cool tools that take a little magic to learn.
Nice.
At
Well,
least that's what I heard. I don't know. It's I guess I should have used Google to fact check that one. But
maybe, but yeah,
I
yeah.
was hoping that you just knew off the cuff.
Unfortunately, I don't. I know a lot, but not when it comes to like early screenwriting softwares that were before my time. Because again, I wasn't even
This
born.
is just
I wasn't
early
even born
word
early enough to
processing in general.
experience a majority of the '90s. But essentially, so his frustration with TV budgets and the fact that none of his pilots were really getting that he was read in were getting picked up ended him obviously pushing him back towards books. And famously, he'd always been a big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, as he's admitted on multiple different occasions. But as he said, mostly, he's interested in seemingly all the boring parts that no one cares about. Like, he's interested in how Aragorn collects taxes, or how Gondor regulates its how Gondor regulates its pipes and its factory. Like, that's the stuff that he's obsessed with as far as in fantasy goes. So he wanted to conceive his own epic fantasy, but he didn't have any ideas as to where to start. So in between Hollywood projects in 91, he started writing a science fiction novel called Avalon, which I believe was published. And then after about 3 chapters that he had written, he had a vivid idea of a boy seeing a man's beheading and then finding wolves in the snow, which of course would end up becoming the first chapter in the novel of the series, which is entitled, obviously, after the whole show, A Game of Thrones. He draws heavy inspiration from his childhood, Lovecraft being one influence, and then some others being Robert E. Howard, Robert A. Heinlein, Eric Frank Russell, Andre Norton, Isaac Asimov, Fritz Leiber, and Mervyn Peake, with his main goal of the series being to combine the purported realism of historical fiction, the grittiness, the excitement that comes with that, like from watching movies, obviously, like Kingdom of Heaven and other medieval-themed movies, with the appeal of fantasy storytelling, which for the most part usually doesn't get into the nitty-gritty realism the way that, you know, some of that other, like, kind of historical fiction would. And another fun fact is that even though there are 5 books, with supposedly 2 more on the way, Martin did previously envision it as a trilogy, with Game of Thrones being the first entry, Dance of Dragons being the middle entry, and Winds of Winter being the final entry. And of course, once upon finishing Game of Thrones, he realized that there was simply still too much story to tell before Dance of Dragons, so that of course led to the publishing of the next 3 books, that being Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords, and A Feast for Crows, before Dance of Dragons was finally released in 2011, concurrently with the first season, and we are still waiting for the Winds of Winter overall. Now, as far as how it gets to HBO, that's a little bit more of an interesting story. As far as that goes, obviously, HBO was looking for...
Dom, so
yes.
Basically the executive was just like, we need a big show.
We need something new. The Sopranos is over. We need.
I've heard there's this fantasy genre.
We need something new here. We need something to, like, occupy the hearts and minds of the people. It's funny because it still reminds me of the fact that, like, before obviously HBO optioned it, he had been approached by a ton of different writers because of the popularity of the show. Because the books are pretty like widely acclaimed, like, throughout the 90s. They won like multiple writing awards. I don't know book awards, unfortunately, as well as I know movie awards. So I'm not going to bother to drop terminology that I don't know. I believe a Hugo Award is one of them. It might be a Gotham Award is one.
Yeah, Hugo's a science fiction thing, definitely.
Okay, that would make sense. That would make sense, definitely. So the books have won multiple awards, obviously. So needless to say, obviously, the movie industry, Hollywood being who they are, wanted to jump on that instantly. Yeah. So
get me that book with the beheading. Like that was the HBO executive. Ready to go.
That was Casey Bloys. He was like, yes, get me that. So. He had been approached by a couple different writers, like, kind of throughout the years, as far as in order to option it into a movie, and he himself considered his own work to be unfilmable, so he was kind of a little bit, pulling a little bit of an Alan Moore there, as far as that goes, being like, my property cannot be filmed.
Yeah. I don't like those authors, man. I got one of those, one of my favorite science fiction authors, Peter F. Hamilton. His stuff is great, and it needs to be filmed. Yeah. But anyway. Yeah.
I also personally don't subscribe to the belief that, like, something is unfilmable, because literally, like, guess what? Zack Snyder did Watchmen as a movie. Say what you will about it, but, like, that was what Watchmen was. Like, so it's not unfilmable. It's just, I'm just gonna chalk that up to artist pretentiousness.
These streaming services, and maybe because of George R. R. Martin and Game of Thrones, they're throwing money left and right at these properties. So any dream is possible. I guess.
Yeah. So, as far as how the property got to HBO, obviously with the growing popularity of the books throughout the years, HBO optioned the rights to adapt it in 2007. So, and how this leads to it is that in 2006, David Benioff, who himself was a novelist and upcoming screenwriter, also, we should mention, sort of a former Goldman Sachs head, so a little bit of nepotism there for you, because that's how Hollywood works, and actually wrote, apparently, did you know this? David Benioff
it's a little
wrote
extreme there,
a little bit, but did you know that David Benioff actually wrote the novel, The 25th Hour? Is that, like, in relation to the Spike movie?
Oh, I don't know. I like I said in the beginning, I was hibernating, so
I have to do some research on that, but that would honestly be like really fascinating if that was the case. But it calls up Martin's agent and says, "Hey, I I want to maybe adapt these books. Can you set up a meeting? He shared his enthusiasm with fellow co-author David Weiss, or better known as DB Weiss, and then they pitched HBO in a series. After a 5-hour meeting with Martin in a restaurant in Santa Monica Boulevard, and gained his enthusiasm support by supposedly answering the question, who is Jon Snow's mother? I should also mention, it is a widely known fact that Benioff and Weiss's primary interest in this was the fact of the major shocking event of that being the Red Wedding. More on that later. So, like I mentioned before,
the pitch meeting was 5 hours?
The meeting with Martin was 5 hours. It did not say how long the pitch meeting actually with Game of Thrones was. Well, although that would be fascinating though if it was 5 hours, because like, could you imagine that?
No, I'm just picturing George R.R. Martin. It's like, okay, I have this fantasy idea. Just think large body count, and then he kind of describes this thing for a couple of hours. And at the end of the 5-hour meeting, the executive is just like, you had me at body count.
You had me at body count. You had me at beheadings. You had me at, I'm like, oh my God. You had me at that. Let's go. Like as I said before, Martin had meetings with other screenwriters who wanted to turn his books into a series of movies, but based on his own words, he considered it to be unfilmable. They began development in 2007 with HBO optioning the rights, with Benioff, Weiss, and Martin all acting as producers. The original deal was that each book would encompass a series of 10 episodes, with Martin writing one episode and Benioff and Weiss the rest. Eventually, Jana Spencer and Brian Cogman were added to the writing staff of the first season. The pilot itself wasn't actually ordered until November of 2008. It was shot in 2009. But received poor reception upon a private viewing at HBO headquarters. So, Pat, I guess this is where I'll segue a little bit here. How much do you know about the original Game of Thrones pilot, like, and like as far as like the shooting process? Because it's become a little bit of a known fact within the fan base as far as Game of Thrones. It was originally had a different pilot with like several different cast members, and it was heavily disliked and is heavily reshot and retooled in order to like kind of work out the kinks and such. Like, did you know about this?
No, not at all. It's like I said, I came late to the whole Game of Thrones party. If I didn't see that sort of like season 2 display in Columbus Circle and talk to my brother about it, I don't think I would have really jumped on the bandwagon. I don't think it was until like season 3 that I started going over to friends' houses and having like dinner parties centered around the show. So
yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, it was season 3. I mean, obviously Blackwater, Ned Stark's death and the Battle of Blackwater got a ton of hype when they came out, but like for me, it was like the kind of the whole it becoming like event viewing. I remember that really started around like season 3 with the Red Wedding, and people were like, "Oh man, where are we going after this?" And it really sucked because that, to me, especially with what came afterward, that might have been like the last like kind of high point where like the quality of the show actually met people's expectations. But yeah, some interesting casting what ifs that almost happened as far as that goes. Originally, Catelyn Stark, Daenerys Targaryen, and Cersei Lannister were played in the original pilot by 3 different people. Catelyn Stark was actually originally portrayed by Jennifer Ale, or as I like to know her, a Meryl Streep doppelganger. Emilia Clarke was originally portrayed by Tamsin Merchant, who I've not seen in anything since. And Cersei Lannister herself was actually originally supposed to be Agent Scully herself, Gillian Anderson. Was originally cast
was
as
the
Cersei
original Ned Stark Sly Stallone?
No, so interestingly enough, as far as the rest of the casting goes, just as far as that goes, so the majority of the cast obviously made it through with auditions, right? Some famous ones obviously being Mark Addy, Harry as Robert Baratheon, Harry Lloyd as Viserys Targaryen, Jack Gleeson as Joffrey Baratheon, and then Kit Harington as Jon Snow. They were like kind of the standouts as far as the audition process went, and all the other majority of the other cast members were still the same. But the two actors, ironically enough, who never had to audition because they were all the Martin and Benioff and Weiss's original choices for the characters were Peter Dinklage as Tyrion and Sean Bean as Ned. Those were the guys that like Martin originally envisioned as those two characters.
Yeah, well, 006 is a great actor, so
yeah, definitely.
Sean Bean all the way.
Sean Bean known for the amount of known as for the amount of times that he famously died throughout Hollywood. So much so that like the last like couple movies that he was in, he surprisingly enough did not die. What's funny though? Actually, there was one movie that I saw recently. It was the movie that the son of David Cronenberg, Brandon Cronenberg, did last year. It was called Possessor, and Sean Bean was in that. And I'm like, ooh, Sean Bean's got this is a sci-fi movie from the son of David Cronenberg. Sean Bean's got to die in this. Like, it's been a while since we've gotten a good Sean Bean death. That, while it's certainly not one of his more memorable deaths, I'll be like, all right, yeah, I'll take it. You know, as far as that went.
This might as well be called Game of Spoilers. You're just
Pretty
going
much,
ahead
yeah.
and telling everybody.
I should probably preface with saying this. Look, Game of Thrones was the most watched show for all of 10 years. So if you're that one guy that like hasn't watched it yet, like just know going in, like this is not like a new like kind of first time reacting. So we will be spoiling the shit out of this show. So like just as far as kind of a precursor in order to know going in.
And any side tangents, will lead to spoilers too.
Yes,
apparently.
yes, indeed. So ultimately, if you do not want to get spoiled on much, definitely do not watch. You're already getting some shout outs as far as the GoldenEye reference. As far as James Bond and everything goes. Real quick, so quick side note. What's your favorite Sean Bean death? This notwithstanding.
Oh my God. I would have to watch a supercut to
How many times? You know what's like really interesting? He's literally died so many times and is so good at it that apparently he was brought on as Liam Neeson's like dying coach for the scene where Liam Neeson has to die at the end of the Phantom Menace, which I mean, I don't know how well that worked considering the fact that he literally does like one more flip even when he dies in that. Like the prequels were just known for the amount of flips that were in them. But oh man, Sean Bean. We're already taking shots at him before this even goes. But yeah. So fun fact as far as the budgets for this go. So the pilot obviously was famously reshot and retooled. And obviously those three parts that I mentioned before were obviously eventually recast with Michelle Fairley, Emilia Clarke, and Lena Headey. Michelle Fairley obviously would only be around for the first 3 seasons, but Emilia Clarke and Lena Headey would be series mainstays up until the final season. It's still insane to me as like how each episode and each season kind of the budget increases much because they started off the pilot the pilot itself only cost HBO like $5 to $10 million, which obviously again is a lot of money, by like normal people standards, but like as far as production budget standards, that was like a lot back in the day. The first season is budgeted at roughly 50 to 60 million, and in comparison to later seasons, the 6th season, obviously which famously contained Battle of the Bastards and Winds of Winter, cost roughly 10 million per episode. And then with the final season was budgeted at roughly 15 million per episode overall. So yeah, a lot of money. Obviously, most of that going towards visual effects work, specifically with how visual effects heavy those last couple seasons got. Like obviously, again, the dragons looked awesome in that last season, much to the chagrin of the storytelling itself. But so the pilot, obviously entitled Winter is Coming, which is also the title of this episode, premiered April 17th, 2011. We mentioned obviously, some certain actors that were cast, but some other obviously actors that helped fill out the cast. Sophie Turner as Sansa Stark, Maisie Williams as Arya Stark, Isaac Hempstead Wright as Bran Stark, Alfie Allen as Theon Greyjoy, Richard Madden as Robb Stark, Rory McCann as Sandor the Hound Clegane, Jason Momoa as Khal Drogo, and Ian Glenn as Jorah Mormont all made their debuts in this episode. Some other minor characters include Donald Sumter as Maester Luwin, Ronald Donachi as Sir Roderick Cassell, Christian Nairn as Hodor, Esme Bianco as Ross, famously the first of Tyrion's many, many conquests throughout the show, and Joseph Mull as Benjen Stark, or as I let's call it, Plot Device Stark, because that's literally all that he's used for as the show goes on.
So you mentioned Jason Momoa.
Yes.
Is this sort of the thing that cemented his popularity? Because I know he was doing a lot of different shows. Like there was this one I was watching. I forgot the name of it. I think it was like Frontiersman or something.
Yeah,
like
Frontier, that
like,
show that he's on Apple.
The Hudson Bay Trading Company or whatever.
Yeah, that's the one.
Pretty interesting show. Like he clearly stood out. In that show,
right, of all the guys that kind of initially cast. Yeah, to me, the people, obviously, again, Peter Dinklage, was the only Peter Dinklage and Sean Bean were really the only actors that I was familiar with going into the show, so needless to say, I was looking forward to them and seeing how they went, because I had read the first book before I actually watched the show, and I mean, right off the bat, I'm like when I heard that, Sean Bean is Ned and Peter Dinklage is Tyrion, I was like in the same boat as Martin.
Yeah, so you read the book, you read these, all the books before watching
I read the first book. And I don't remember what book I was on, but I think I was about halfway through Clash of Kings before I started the show, because I started the show late. Actually, I didn't watch it originally when it debuted. I started watching the show while season 3 was airing, right?
Gotcha,
And
gotcha.
then
So you're very
I
similar to me. I
yes.
started watching maybe a season before you, but
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and then
kind of
I binged the first 3 seasons roughly, and then season 4 to me was the first season that I started watching in real time when I started watching the episodes like week to week,
yeah.
episode to
Like
episode.
what I will say is, at some point I started to read the book, and I think if you watch the TV show, at least like probably the first 3, 4 seasons, then you go try to read the books. It's one of those things that first book mirrors the first season so well
Yes.
that it's actually kind of a hard read if you've already seen the first season, because you're
Yeah,
just like, oh, that's
I know what's
exactly
gonna
what
happen.
happened.
Yeah, it's
It loses a little bit of its magic
yes,
because you sort of already know what's happening.
yes,
You know all the setups, you know all the payouts. Like it might be a little nostalgic, but I feel like book readers are probably a little more nostalgic about
right.
rereading the book than if you're just like a TV guy like I am, going and jumping into the book realm. So
Yeah, definitely.
um,
It definitely makes that interesting as far as that goes, kind of with my relation with kind of books to film. Obviously, my whole kind of process now, and I feel like this is true for a lot of people, is that if something's coming out that I know is based off of a book, I have to read the book before I actually watch the media property. Because if I watch the media property first, I'm like, yeah, reading books always takes longer than watching something. So
yeah,
naturally, I'm gonna have no interest in trying to read something after I watch
yeah.
it. It
So
just
so
kind of defeats
Dom,
the purpose.
another question that I have on my mind is, what do you know about the shooting locations? Because
Yeah.
you
So.
you threw a note down here, and I'm like, Belfast, Ireland, Scotland,
Yep.
Malta, and all these beautiful locations, and you could definitely see it on the screen.
Yes, absolutely.
And clearly, like I said, you did all the research for this episode. So please share.
Yeah,
Tell
so
me about these beautiful
a
places.
majority of the interiors obviously are done at Paint Hole Studios in Belfast, Ireland. And as far as the majority
Oh, it looks like Tom totally went. Hopefully, we are live. Our
and a
audio.
majority of the southern locations, and then some of the certain of the eastern locations, like once you got to Essos, those were the ones that were primarily shot in Spain, Malta, and Croatia. It's funny because my cousins actually were able to kind of do a little getaway during the pandemic, and were able to go to Croatia, and a big tourist spot was the steps where they famously shot a lot of iconic scenes from the show. That a lot of people taking pictures of, namely, Cersei's Walk of Penance, the scene where, they bring the Tyrell army in season 6, a lot of scenes from the Great Sept, and all of those were shot in
is
Croatia.
Croatia basically like King's Landing, or
Yes.
do they double multiple spots?
Yeah, they doubled multiple spots for certain of the locations in order to get certain of the locales, but yeah, majority of King's Landing was Croatia and Malta, and then, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was for the Dorne parts, right? Because that's the whole thing, right? Is a majority of like kind of the exteriors are like certain parts of the countries, right? With CG with the castles added, kind of layered on top of it. And then obviously a majority of the interiors that you see, most of those were just done in Pine Hall Studios within Belfast. So, I mean, that's kind of a little bit of a behind the scenes movie magic. The other thing too that I think is really interesting as far as just comparing this episode and this season overall to later seasons when they got like really effects heavy and like you could just tell the budget was up, is like kind of seeing like even with the exteriors, like can kind of notice the noticeability of the sets overall, and just like kind of, that's one thing that I always like to do with shows, specifically long running shows, is like kind of how the production shifts as the budget gets bigger. I'm also I'm almost done with my Sopranos rewatch, and that's another thing that I noticed as well, is how starkly different the first season looks in comparison to the later season, just from the way the lighting and the cinematography goes.
I think the first season of most shows, right? Even though this is sort of a big budget show, and but I imagine that the budgets grew over time, and
Right.
as you sort of cement such a big crew, and they do a number of episodes together. You're basically getting more and more efficient in how you produce these things.
Right.
More ambitious too in terms of what you can do per episode. So,
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
lot of television, you're definitely going to see usually a big jump from like the first season to the final season.
Right.
Which then we can argue that the final seasons of this were a
Yeah,
little
we'll see
too
that. Yeah, maybe a
economical and rushed.
little bit too much emphasis was on the production and not as much on the script. But again,
Yeah.
get to that. Yeah.
So So before we get ahead of ourselves and talk about what we didn't like about the end of the
Yeah.
series, why don't we stick to what this show's
Pretty
about,
much. Yeah.
which is
So,
that first episode, and sort of
yeah.
go through, what we saw
Yeah,
in
definitely
this
good
episode.
idea. So starting off, famously cold open. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the premiere of each season ends up starting off with this with these cold opens, which I was famously I was actually really didn't keep track of as far as that went, but it's definitely interesting, to kind of keep track of as far as when time goes on. But you have that iconic introduction scene where we aren't actually introduced to any of the main characters, which of course is pulled right from the prologue of the first book of Game of Thrones, which is the three Night's Watch members. Again, book readers, famous book readers who are interested in every little tidbit and detail will know those three Night's Watch members as Sir Waymar Royce, Gareth, and Will, traveling north of the Wall in order to inspect a potential wildling encampment, and ultimately end up discovering that they have all been slaughtered brutally before, unfortunately, discovering that the wildlings have been brought back to life, seemingly, and were first introduced to what would ultimately become the ultimate end-all be-all threat of the show, which is, of course, the White Walkers, these white kind of ancient beings that can bring people back from the dead. Again, they're not quite zombies. They're more so the necromancers that eventually turn the bodies into, the zombies. That's why, as far as differentiating, the White Walkers, they're the ones that bring people back to dead. And then the Whites are the reanimated corpses.
Yeah, I think, it's really smart to start the show off with like, here's the fantasy element, at least one of the fantasy elements, because no matter where you go from, killer zombies, there's going to be these elements in the show. What I will say about this opening, um, you know, uh, wasn't there a little bit of a flashback for him like finding the bodies and then like him arriving with his Night's Watch members? It was sort
Uh,
of like a
yeah.
a strangely edited sequence.
Yeah.
You know, uh, it's kind of like fire up Game of Thrones episode 1, let's rewatch it, and then it's like this kind of confusing
Yeah.
sequence
Like it
of
makes
how
more
they
sense.
discover these bodies.
Yeah, it makes more sense as far as like the rest of the episode and the rest of the season goes. But yeah, definitely for like a first time watcher who's definitely like has no idea what's going on. It certainly, as far as an opening sequence that like locks you in, it definitely like achieves its job. But yeah, the one thing I did notice is that like again, like you said, the budget in these couple opening seasons were definitely not as high as later on. So it did that thing that I don't like that a lot of things do, which is a lot of shaky editing in order to like
Yeah.
kind of up the
And
suspense factor.
one of the things is like, now that we're rewatching the show, we can basically kind of discuss like our fantasy rewriting of
Yep.
the show.
Yep.
And so you're talking about these cold opens, and 6 Feet Under did a lot of good
Yep.
cold opens
Yeah.
about the people that died and ended up in the morgue.
Yeah.
Could you imagine like a couple of people ended up dead, and basically you had like the Monty Python, like bring out your dead guys and they got to take care of the
Bring
bodies.
out your dead.
You
Bring
know,
out your
anyway,
dead.
sorry.
It's
Cheap
like
joke.
I'm not dead. Yes, you are. I'm actually
So
feeling quite. You're sick. He's doing terrible. He'll be dead soon. I'm actually feeling much better. No, don't get me started.
yeah,
I'll go on for
but
days. I'll go on for
yeah,
days on a Monty
but
Python rant.
other than the cheap joke, Tom, the iconic thing that did actually lasted is that animated intro, right?
Yes, the animated.
Showing
Oh
us
man.
all the locations that are going to take place in each episode.
Yes, absolutely. The famous animated intro that kind of introduces you to like the geography of how Westeros and Essos match up, showing us the primary locations. Obviously, more would be added as the show goes on, but for that, at least that primary location, we have King's Landing, we have Winterfell, we have the Wall, and we have Pentos of the Free Cities later on, which we see, which is one of the 9 free cities, which we'll get into. So then after that, we have the introduction to Winterfell, obviously the home of the Starks, kind of the capital de facto of the North. We meet the Stark family, Ned Stark, his wife Catelyn, and his 5 main children, and then his 1 bastard son, that being Robb, Sansa, Arya.
So based on this sequence, Tom, I know I'm going to cut you off, but like
it's fine.
in terms of this sequence, I just got to know, who was your favorite Stark? Like,
Okay.
who was it? You got to pick one. Who was it in this intro?
So are you talking just specifically for this sequence, or are you talking just overall?
Who had the best introduction? And
Okay.
don't say Sansa and her
No,
knitting,
not that.
you
Not
know, because
not
I
the
don't know
knitting
if that was
because
as
that
exciting.
establishes Arya more than anything else. And like we'll get into like Benioff and Weiss's like weird obsession with Maisie Williams as time goes on. But I mean, Jon obviously was a big standout. Bran obviously was a standout, but that was mostly just because I kind of knew what was coming as far as what was going to happen with him. Robb was always a character that I never really cared about that much. Theon is almost like kind of like a blinker you'll miss it character in this opening sequence. It's kind of interesting to me, just like again, like for how big of a character Theon becomes with how
Yeah,
with time goes on.
I would say Theon basically and Jon Snow have this little butting heads
Yeah,
throughout this sequence.
right.
Rob is sort of just there,
Yeah.
he's like the older brother, and he's sort of
Right, he's like the old, kind of
told
the
that.
maternal,
Yeah,
responsible older brother. He seems like obviously he's the eldest. He seems like the most likely to succeed. But no, it's
who is it?
Ned.
Who is it, Dom? Who
It's
is your
Ned.
favorite
It's Ned
character?
easily.
Oh,
Ned
okay,
Stark. He's the
Ned.
man. I mean, not technically in this sequence, but really the next one. But like, yeah, because I'm like, yeah, I see Sean Bean. I know him as Boromir, obviously from Lord of the Rings, but and like he's kind of like the maternal. It's literally the personification. Like the difference being is that none of the other actors that portrayed the rest of the Starks I was really familiar with at that point, so I kind of just saw them as their characters, But like I see Sean Bean, and it's always like kind of that thing where I talk about where like kind of the celebrity of it can be a little bit distracting when you like want to capture a particular character. But it was Daniel Radcliffe in Harry Potter as far as that goes. Sean Bean just captured everything that was Ned Stark, like his tenacity, his machismo, but also his like very kind of withheld nature. He played that very well. He's like loving father
I
1 minute and.
I definitely think Ned is a good choice. For me, in terms of like, just like Arya, I think does steal the show with these sort of
Yes.
bow and
Yes.
arrow and showing people up, and just like showing that she's not willing to fit the mold
Right.
that this world sort of sets.
Yes.
Bran is like climbing up on the walls and whatnot, and that's one of the characterizations early on in this episode that really irked me, because the second literally that I saw him climbing on the side
You're
of the
like,
castle,
he's
I
falling.
was like,
You're like,
he's falling.
he's like Humpty
He's
Dumpty going for a nice big
yeah,
fall.
he's injured. It's like it's happening. You're not convincing me
And that was
otherwise.
without having read the books.
Yeah.
That was
So
without even having read the
well,
books.
it has to do with the way that it was done. It was very framed in that we're setting something up, we're
Right.
foreshadowing something,
Right. Which
and
again, like,
so
it's weird because we're actually going to get to that as far as like our review segments. But like this show was definitely doing the thing as far as like, yeah, this is not going to be a situation of like kind of the story of the week. This is very clearly setting itself up as being a part of this massive continuing story,
yeah.
And we've kind of
Well,
seen the ripple effects throughout as time has gone on.
Yeah, it's kind of like they were playing the long game. Like I would say, like if this particular episode was the story of the week, it would be about Ned Stark and his understanding and his sort of the way that he handles oaths.
Right.
Because the sequence that we're talking about is about catching that night watchman after he sees the White Walkers and runs away, and he gets and like Ned has to punish him.
Right.
It's sentenced to death
Right.
for abandoning his duty
Yeah.
and his oath.
Yeah.
And so Ned executes this himself. Like, it's like, I forgot what he said, but the
The
quote was
man who
something.
passes the sentence should swing the sword. I actually had it written down as far as quotes to cover from the episode. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, I agree
Yeah,
with you
great,
100%.
great quote. And essentially, like Ned says that, and it basically does come up later in the episode when Robert Baratheon asks him to come to King's Landing for
Right.
the hand. And so I think that would be, I think that was the kind of like the juicy part of the meat for this episode. And the way that they do it is they sort of just have those two scenes, and they don't really give them like full frontal like exposure. It's sort of just like they're embedded in the rest of the story.
Right.
And so it's definitely a difference in style that they chose to do the show. So let's continue at least with the
Yeah.
recap.
So,
It's basically, I'll just basically they find the dire wolves and they give one to each
Yep.
children.
Yeah, after they execute the Night's Watchman, and that obviously
Yeah.
the Bran asks Ned about if he was lying about seeing the White Walkers. Ned says, "Oh, the White Walkers have been gone for thousands of years." They're on the way back. They find the dire wolves.
Doesn't he say something like he was probably telling the truth, but too
Yeah,
fast?
but a madman sees what he sees is I believe the
Okay.
exact terminology. But yeah, so they're on their way
Yeah.
back, and they find again a very foretelling. A lot of people kind of read a lot into this scene as far as the fact that they see a dire wolf having been stabbed by a deer, a Baratheon, obviously potentially, you know, symbolizing the later on betrayal by the Starks, by the by the Baratheons, or in this case the Lannisters, kind of hiding behind the Baratheons' coattails as far as that goes. But obviously they famously see the direwolf, which is of course the sigil of their house. This is the direwolf is the sigil of House Stark. And after a little bit of convincing, Ned decrees that each of the 6 remaining direwolves will go to each of his children. Like I said before, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, youngest son Rickon, and then of course bastard son Jon Snow. Cut to King's Landing, the capital of Westeros, far to the south. You have a funeral of Jon Arryn, who is the previous Hand of the King, which is basically like the King's right-hand man. And we're introduced to our first 2 of the Lannisters of the show, Cersei and Jaime Lannister, portrayed respectively by Lena Headey and Nikolai Coster-Waldau. This is interesting because this was the first scene in this episode that was not pulled from the books, where, and it's weird because it's kind of like spoilery in hindsight, but like where they're basically admitting in the moment that they're not responsible for Jon Arryn's death, which is weird because the whole kind of point of that in the books is the fact that obviously later on when Catelyn receives the letter from her sister, it's basically, you know, setting up the fact that the Lannisters are, you know, are the prime suspects in this murder, you know, but kind of seeing this scene as opposed to only like hearing about it as far as that goes, you know, like does it kind of shift anything, kind of knowing that, you know, that this scene never existed in the books?
You know, it's to me, I expect a little bit of you know, massaging of the story, and like, you know, I don't know if it would be a major alteration. It's just sort of something that helps you know, move the episode forward. Like, you basically introduced all the Starks, and now you got to introduce the other characters.
Right.
And so this is just probably one of those sequences, like, let's get them sort of plotting and talking about this, and you know, introduce the whole dynamic that they're sort of going behind Robert Baratheon's back, and whatnot. Like, so I think this is, you know, the next little bit of sequence. I don't know if anything major takes place. It's basically just making sure you understand that Robert Baratheon is going to move to Winterfell. He's going to take like a month journey to basically entice Ned to be his next Hand of the King,
next Hand of the King.
To replace Jon Arryn, who has just died.
Yeah.
You know,
Jon Arryn, of course, a little bit of backstory. Jon Arryn famously having mentored both Ned and Robert when they were young. Ned and Robert being childhood friends, obviously, with Robert being tasked to kind of take over King's Landing early after the death of his parents at sea. So Jon Arryn was you know, kind of one of those mentor figures that was like, you know, a father figure to these two growing up.
Yeah. So does this go straight into like the month has happened and they traveled
again, like
and
that's
they're
the one
there?
thing where I'll be like, okay, I'll call bullshit as far as the later seasons go, where everyone is getting mad at them teleporting multiple locations in episode, but like this first episode, like literally a month like happens between like scenes that literally happened like right next to each other.
Well,
so
was there a fade in, fade out at least?
No,
I don't remember.
No, it was a direct cut. It was a direct cut,
Oh,
like
really?
a direct cut from Jaime and Cersei in King's Landing to next thing you know, Kat is going up to Ned in the Godswood and being like, "Hey, Robert's on his way." You know,
it's like SpongeBob. 1 month later.
1 month
You know?
later, like not even graphics. The only graphics that we get in this episode are basically to tell us the locations as far as that
Okay,
goes.
so basically the next major thing that happens then is you get the introduction of Tyrion, and he's kind of sleeping around. His brother wants him to be at dinner because he doesn't want to be left alone.
Yep. Oh, Tyrion's introduction is the best. I know, obviously, it would never fly in today's standards. Obviously, the introduction of Ross, just to one opening shot of him getting the blowjob, and I'm like, wow, okay, the way to introduce this guy.
Well, welcome to HBO, right?
Yeah,
you know,
true.
You know,
true.
we're all adults here for watching, I guess. You know,
I don't know. I guess it's just more so a matter of like Peter Dinklage's facial expressions of like, okay, like.
You know, it's like set your parental controls if you have little ones
definitely.
in the house, you know.
Most definitely.
So yeah, the no Tyrion checkbox, you know, anything that he would do, you're not
instantly already establishing him as like, this is a guy that you're gonna want to watch, like, because he's already like kind of the most. Don't get me wrong, like they've already, I think, done a pretty good job of like establishing all the characters at this point, but like already like having the eye that they're like, keep your eye on this guy because this guy is gonna be important at least for the next couple seasons.
Because I know it's important. The last thing with this whole visit, or at least the first part of the visit, is they do visit Lyanna's grave.
Yes.
So, like, why don't you just
Yeah,
fill
so basically,
fill
it's
us in on
they
that?
arrive in King's Landing. Robert, of course, has this big joke. Obviously, famously, the scene. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but later on, it was pointed out that every single Stark that Robert actually physically makes contact with in this scene would eventually end up dying. That, of course, being Ned, Catelyn, Robb, and Rickon. With the other 4 Starks that he did not touch, that being Jon, Sansa, Arya, and Bran, surviving throughout the majority of the shows. That was just an interesting little tidbit that the internet has, of course, picked up on throughout the years. But yeah, so Robert and Ned famously head to Winterfell's famous crypts, which is where they bury their dead. They go to Ned's sister Lyanna's grave, who was unfortunately died during the War of the Five Kings, which famously was what allowed Robert Baratheon to become king after the in order to succeed the almost 1,000-year Targaryen dynasty that was there before him. And Robert, of course, makes his official proclamation to Ned to be his hand of the king. And while at Lyanna's grave, Lyanna, of course, Ned's sister, was originally engaged to Robert Baratheon prior to her death. And he says, what's it called? Is kind of very much not only still kind of what's the word? Very much pining over her, but also just very much bearing a lot of hatred towards the recently deceased Targaryens, in which, of course, Ned brings up that the Targaryens are gone, and Robert famously says, not all of them. Cut to Pentos, the free city, on the opposite side of the world, on Essos, the only other known continent in this world, where we meet one of the last 2 surviving Targaryens, the princess of the famously deceased Mad King, who Robert and Ned killed in their, or well, not specifically, killed in their last rebellion, that being Daenerys Targaryen and her delightful brother Viserys Targaryen, which, there was a reason why this guy only lasts 6 episodes.
Yeah, Viserys, this opening episode scene, if I remember, it's kind of like the bathhouse scene.
Yep.
Between siblings.
Yeah.
It's just like what
so uncomfortable.
What
on so many different levels.
This guy he's just like, I'm gonna sell you.
Yeah.
And in the most visceral way possible.
It's like, I mean, I don't want to question like the writing motives, like as far as like, showing that like, yeah, these 2 have been through hell, and now she's like kind of got to go through more hell before she can see like any semblance of normalcy again. But I will give Martin credit for this as far as like, showing that like, yeah, when somebody like conquers something and like earns a title, like they really have to earn it. So like, I think he does a very good job as far as like establishing the difference there, like kind of between somebody like Daenerys, who is very, very timid and like not all the Daenerys that we would come to know as the show went on, versus someone like Viserys, who again, it's got a little bit of that Stockholm thing where even though Viserys is very clearly like one of just the worst people on the planet as far as that goes, just with his initial treatment of her, like they kind of depend on each other because they're literally the last 2. Their brother is dead, their dad's dead, their mom's dead.
I think this is the main part of their, Daenerys' story, is that her brother was clinging on to the idea that they had the power and they deserved the power, that they were privileged to the power, and essentially Viserys basically just made a huge miscalculation that you can't throw around your weight when you have no weight to throw
when
around.
You have no weight to throw around, which he clearly did not.
And so basically, that's a couple more episodes from now. But for the most part, this whole sequence that takes place in Essos is going to be the whole, meeting of Khal Drogo, Jason Momoa, and, showing basically, his sister Daenerys to him. And the one free city guy, basically
Magister Illyrio Mopakis.
Okay, yeah, the Magister. So he basically, is saying, well, no response is the best response, or whatever. And so
I believe the exact wordage is that, trust me, if he wasn't pleased by her, we would know.
Yeah, so assuming that, I guess she would be dead.
I don't know. I don't want to know. Like, from what I've heard about the Dothraki, is that what's best is left kind of to the imagination overall. But
I guess it's also weird that like you're in these cities and you're just like, oh, there's the massive horde out there. Why don't you flag them down for a marriage proposal? you know,
Like that's the army that they're gonna go with. Well, I mean, it makes sense because obviously the Dothraki famously being modeled after the Mongols. Obviously, again, it's like yeah, if they're like kind of the last two of their kind and they want an army to take back their home, like the Dothraki is their best bet as far as that goes. But again, like just kind of like basically to simplify it, Viserys wants to take back the Iron Throne, obviously from the people who are residing there, and his plan is to quite literally, sell his sister into a marriage by wedding her to Khal Drogo, who is the leader of the largest Khalasar of the Dothraki fields. There are multiple Khalasars, but Drogo is famously the biggest and the baddest, at least at the start of it.
Yeah, and I get the impression from this episode that there's a lot of marriages between the
yes,
civilized cities
yes.
and the
And the
Dothraki.
Dothraki, yes. But again, like
Yeah,
that's a thing that, like, again, is common in Westeros too. It was just a thing that was common in obviously in medieval. 90, in fact, almost 100% of marriages were not done out of love or passion. They were done out of, what's the easiest way in order to, unite our kingdom so that we don't end up going to war with each other. Oh, I have a son. Quite literally, to quote Robert Baratheon, I have a son. You have a daughter. Let's join our houses. Oh, do they actually know each other, or did they actually have any time to spend with each other? Nope. Who cares? And that's basically how things were done back in the day.
yeah. I don't know. It's one of the things is it's very interesting that you have these differing social structures set up that are living in sort of bounce. But the interesting thing about Daenerys and Essos throughout the whole entire series is that it almost seems like a civilization of the season. Like she jumps
Yes.
from one civilization to the next to
Yes.
the next.
Yes.
So you don't
Definitely a
get too
means of
much
like
of
kind of
that
introducing us to
integration.
different elements of the world as we go on.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah,
basically, the rest of this storyline is kind of intercut back in
back and forth,
Winterfell with,
right?
I guess up next, it's Tyrion is sort of talks with Jon Snow.
Yes.
He like offends him, by basically calling him a bastard, and
Yeah, but then they kind of
uh,
like have a little bit of a meeting in the minds as far as like kind of both recognizing their kind of individual stance in their families, right? Jon is looked down upon and not really recognized as a full Stark by Cat. And Tyrion, obviously famously well known as the most hated Lannister sibling by their father, who we have yet to meet, Tywin Lannister. And again, leaves me with two of my absolute favorite quotes. Again, like two of the most famous quotes of the show that both come from this show. The first one being, let me give you some advice, bastard. Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor. That way it can never be used against you. And then afterwards, after his response, when Jon asks him what does he know about being a bastard, Tyrion responds by saying, all dwarves are bastards in their father's eyes. And the whole armor thing, that really kind of spoke to me personally, just as somebody who I'll be the first to admit has experienced a lot of bullying in his life and has like kind of been like kind of teased and ostracized for like, being different or not really like satisfying the status quo. I feel like that's something that, like a majority of people who just podcast on the internet can kind of relate to as far as that goes. But like at the time period, I think it was like a freshman or sophomore in high school, like that meant a lot, like hearing that from someone like, obviously again, Peter Dinklage being the badass that he is, like he is, a little person. So he is obviously, definitely dealt with his fair share of probably ridicule throughout his life. So there was definitely kind of something like really refreshing that comes from that statement. It's one of the reasons why I kind of gravitate towards that phrase, like more than any others.
yeah, I definitely agree with you. Like, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, yeah, that's a great line. It's like it's
It's
true.
like it
Like you
shows.
can identify to it.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you need to wear it as an armor for sure. If you've ever been in one of those situations.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of want to. I know like there's a lot that still happens in this
Right, but
episode, but I
the
want to.
majority of the rest of the episode is mostly just cutting back and forth between Daenerys' wedding and the party that's in Winterfell that's kind of happening.
Yeah, and
Literally,
so the major thing with the wedding is we meet Sir Jorah,
yes,
who basically is going to be a major figure in Daenerys's
yes.
life, and basically he's clearly on a mission to make sure that she has books, that she has
Right,
luxuries.
that she kind of
Um,
learns about, learn. It's really interesting, kind of how the seeds are sown as far as like her. Yeah, if she will eventually inherit Westeros, like she needs to learn about the country and she needs to like be familiar with the people. Like kind of already planting the seeds as far as like what she's gonna need to know as far as the rest of her journey goes.
Yeah, but it's clear that he's going to be an ally, even though she's going to descend down the rabbit hole of being a bride of a Dothraki.
Right.
So, which basically, the first wedding night is not exactly uh, what I would say easy for her. Basically, it's it just he has his way
Yeah,
with the bride.
the first scene. I'll just say that like that scene made me uncomfortable when I read it the first time. It made me uncomfortable when I watched it the first time. It made me uncomfortable when I watched it the second time. It made me uncomfortable when I watched it the third time. And now that I've watched it for like the fourth, I've seen this pilot a lot. I've watched this pilot probably more than any other TV pilot. In case you didn't get that reference, and I'll say after watching it, yep. Still really uncomfortable. Like I know obviously what it leads to, but like their wedding night, let's just say, not a fan. Again, like I just like how it plays out,
Yeah, I think in the pilot having a scene like this is really meant to make sure that you understand that this show is going to go in many different directions.
Yes,
going to show different possibilities within human nature, and so it is one of those first like very kind of, I guess, like crucial,
yes,
shocking moments. Like,
yes.
oh man, this is what the show is gonna show us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna fast track. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm just gonna fast track through some other like majorly important, like kind of like moments and tidbits that happen throughout these next couple seasons before we get to the last scene, which is obviously
really two more moments.
Yeah, well, obviously Daenerys receiving the dragon eggs as the gift from Illyrio. That's a big thing. Obviously, she receives the dragon eggs that eventually hatch and become her 3 dragons from Illyrio. And kind of no mention is ever made as to where he got them from. And then obviously Viserys, kind of questions, when are we gonna start planning the invasion? He's like, when the Dothraki omens favor war. He's like, well, I piss on Dothraki omens. Okay, yeah, definitely an indicator that this guy's gonna be around for a while. And meanwhile, a couple more tidbits at kind of the Winterfell party. Obviously you also have the arrival of, like I said, plot device. Ned Stark's younger brother, Benjen Stark, who's a ranger in the Night's Watch. They have a discussion about the ranger that Ned beheaded, who Benjen Stark claims was tough. And was just a lad, but a tough lad. So if something spooked him, that definitely means that something was interesting. Ned has a confrontation with Jaime that I find is interesting, kind of setting up their rivalry that will progress throughout the season. Some other little tidbits, Arya, shooting stuff at Sansa, kind of setting up their relationship. Sansa trying to suck up to Cersei already, and Cersei noticing Robert flirting with just literally every single woman that he gets his hands on. I do find it an interesting little tidbit that, Robert Baratheon's a king, but it's almost like he prefers being with like the common folk, it's almost like that's where he finds more of his kinship. I feel like that says a lot about his character. So we cut to the next major sequence after that is Ned and Kat kind of, in bed together after the night. After the night's festivities, when they receive a letter in the night, famously from the maester of the castle, Maester Lewin, that is from Lysa, Kat's sister Lysa, who is the recent widow of Jon Arryn, who has sent her sister a letter potentially warning them that she believes that the Lannisters are behind the death of Jon Arryn. Again, this scene, I remember, had a lot of weight when I first read it for the first time in the books, but again, it's kind of undercut here, but the fact that we already saw Cersei and Jaime admit that they weren't responsible for it, but... Yeah,
I think the main thing is, after the note is read and everything, the gentleman that came in with the note, I forgot his name already.
Maester Lewin.
Yeah, Maester Lewin, basically... he basically talks about, the importance of Ned being there to really uphold that oath to his friend, the oath of friendship.
Right.
And that really kind of completes sort of the major story of this episode is like Ned understands completely in that moment that he is bound by an oath of friendship to accept the hand of the king. And he's going to go and do that for the rest of the series.
So unfortunately, while Kat is very much against the idea of him going south, potentially, as she quite literally says, they killed the last hand. What do you think they're going to do to him? But Maester Lewin says, again, this is Ned's nature. Ned, as famously as we know, is a man of honor. He is a guy who upholds his oaths no matter what scenario it puts him in, even at the behest of his own life. And our final scene that we really have to talk about, famously...
it's also about our focus character, Bran.
Yes,
right?
It's about Bran. Bran Stark, our focus character. Unfortunately, as Tyrion has his encounter with, again, the Hound and his only speaking line in this episode, we get more of the Hound, obviously, as time later goes on, but where he says... it's like, oh, I'm the best hunter, and he's like, oh, it's not hunting if you pay for it. And I thought that was kind of a clever little joke that they said. But obviously, famously, the group all leaves for the hunt. Bran has his infamous little climb, and of course, he stumbles upon, again, the first of many incest relationships that we'll see. Jaime and Cersei just going at it, just bare bone doggy
Doesn't he
style.
stumble
Like,
upon some like on the nose dialogue too? Like,
a little
just,
bit, a little bit.
They're just like, we're gonna kill him.
Yeah,
You know, it's
pretty
like-
much. He's like, they're literally like something like that. Like that was the whole thing, right? Is the fact that like in the books they actually are like discussing like having the discussion about Jon Arryn, and obviously before when they're having sex, and then famously Jaime catches Bran. And he's like, Cersei's just going on. He's like, he saw us. Obviously, Jaime does a little look-see around, making sure no one else is there aside for the direwolf. And he's like, I heard you the first time. And then he looks up back, and he's like, how old are you? And he's like, 10. He's like, wow, yeah, it's impressive how much of a climber you are. And then, of course, famously turns to Cersei and is like, the last iconic quote that I've written down, the things that I do for love, and pushes him right out the window. And the last shot that we see is his little body, from the back, like as he goes up on whatever like soundstage green screen he's on before he hits the ground, and that is the end of our first episode primarily. And that brings us into our focus character segment. Obviously, talking about again, he's the first major character.
Because you wanted to talk about sort of some of the lore that's going on,
definitely
in terms of this character. So just give us a quick rundown of what lore we should understand about Bran.
Yeah, certainly. So just
like going forward, this is what should be in the
right. Yeah. So as far as the focus character, so Bran is the first focus character that we're introduced to after the prologue in a Game of Thrones. The two focus chapters that are on him is the first chapter where that leads from the execution of the Night's Watchmen to them finding the direwolves, and then the last sequence, which is him obviously stumbling upon Cersei and Jaime and falling out the end of the window. Obviously, again, this was a very famous scene, shocking scene that really latched you in to the rest of the series overall. But Bran, obviously the second youngest of the Stark children, the only younger one being Rickon Stark, has a little bit of an interesting situation because even though he's our focus character, he is kind of out of commission for the first half of the season, and then when he comes back and wakes up, doesn't really have that much. He's kind of known, obviously, as being paralyzed because famously the fall does paralyze him. But the interesting thing about his arc as far as it goes throughout the rest of the season is that he famously kind of taps into and is kind of like our focus and entry point into the more magical elements that start to like become more apparent as the series goes on. Obviously with the Red Priestesses of Ashai and kind of the origins of the dragons and their power, and the whites and what powers them. And then the thing that kind of is really for most part like kind of a forgotten element as the show goes on, which is the idea of wargs, of one of which Bran is. Bran is really the only warg that we see in the show. But famously, it is also known in the books that both Jon and Arya are wargs as well, that being somebody who is able to project their consciousness into other living beings like animals, in this case, obviously the Starks with their direwolves, obviously with Bran's direwolf Summer, and it eventually leads Bran on the path to, in the books, tapping into his green seer abilities, and which eventually leads to him becoming the Three-Eyed Raven, and unfortunately, to the detriment, it seems like, of the overall story, him somehow being crowned king? For whatever reason, like that part still kind of baffles me as far as that goes. But
wasn't it prisoner Tyrion who basically suggested, hey, let's vote
pretty much? He's literally like, hey, let's just make this guy, king, because he can literally he's basically like God essentially. So we should make God like some really weird mixed messages that come from that last episode.
Bran goes basically from being pushed off the building to being voted king. In which also prisoners can vote too. It's a very weird arc.
Look, I understand the sentiment as far as them kind of, him being kind of the focal entry point into the magic world, and him eventually being like a crucial part that was needed in, the upcoming war with the war, obviously eventually with the Night King and the White Walkers, as far as him learning crucial information in his studying with the Three-Eyed Raven, and and learning about the Children of the Forest, and learning about the origin of the White Walkers and everything, and all of that stuff is very crucial. The problem comes from the fact, and this is a criticism that I know has been lobbied at him many times, the fact that he's primarily used as an exposition device in order to kind of just get across kind of the crucial information, which to me kind of detracts from his character, because as far as kind of like I felt like there was something really fascinating there as far as like kind of him being it seemed like he was like coming into his own as far as like starting his journey to becoming a man in this episode, as far as witnessing the execution and not looking away, and and Ned having that heart to heart with him. It was kind of like explaining why he was the one that cut off the guy's head. And obviously, again, how that's foreshadowing for what later happens to Ned, but also like how it kind of seems like Bran, and also with the line with Robert telling him, he'll be a soldier. It's almost like kind of setting him up to like kind of be like this focal epicenter. And I understand where Benioff and Weiss were going as far as, making him king at the end, and, their never-ending attempt to like kind of subvert expectations, another term that has been just completely bastardized by the internet. as far as, him being crippled and then him essentially becoming God through these kind of like this magical, this sort of magical, like
Well,
Doctor Strange-esque teaching.
Well, two things I want to say is like for this particular episode, like again, Bran sort of, learning and starting to be a man and taking his place amongst the family and then being pushed and that sort of sends him in a different direction.
Quite
And
literally pushed in a different direction.
yeah, and we see that kind of explored throughout the rest of the first season and the series. But like this is definitely another moment that could be, part of the story of the episode. And so
Yes.
I think, keep that in mind in terms of like what they're doing in terms of like spreading out these stories over time and not necessarily focusing on developing them clearly. Like each story gets like equal time, more or less, and none really kind of goes over the other
Right.
at this point. And so I think in the first episode, you're talking about like what did happen. It's a little bit of this happened, a little bit of that. You're not following the thread, you're following multiple threads. And I think with the first episode, that's kind of a hard sell. The
Right.
other thing with Bran is I think you're right, Dom, like he's underutilized, in terms of all these sort of magic and
Right.
the
As
world
far as the majority
building.
of the shit, there's literally an entire season where he's just not there. Like he's completely
Yeah.
absent for all
So
of season 5.
one of the things I think would be great to come from this series as a whole, specifically with Bran, is if you sort of did a Bran TV show where he's sort of going through time and dropping into
Right.
different bodies, and you're giving us the lore of different time periods, and I think that could be a very interesting, um, you know almost like if you remember the third Harry Potter,
Yep.
the
Yeah.
Prisoner of
Yeah.
Azkaban with
Yeah.
the watch, and there's
Yeah,
like
with the time turner, with the alternate timeline. Yeah. Well, it's
yeah,
fascinating that you bring
so
that up because that's literally a plot element of, because literally Bran's entire kind of, for lack of a better word, plot in A Dance with Dragons, the 5th book, which is when he came back within the books, because famously Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons famously took place in the same time period, right? But because there were so many characters that had to be split up amongst different books, and Bran is just learning from the Three-Eyed Raven, and the entire series of sequence of chapters that he does is literally doing exactly that, which is kind of plopping around, going and learning about like different past and presents, and communicating with different characters across different time periods. There's even one instance where he communicates with Theon, and in a way almost helps restore Theon's personality from Reek to Theon when Theon's going through his little Reek phase, obviously. And we sort of touch on that in season 6, as far as like kind of how that's utilized, as far as with the reveal of John's parentage and everything. But ultimately, I feel like it's all for naught as far as how it's utilized within the show. But we got 2 more segments that we want to talk about before we begin to wrap it up, which is the history of the GOTchaverse, which I love how you coined that. As far it just worked as far as the initials, obviously Game of Thrones GOT, and obviously famously the fact that Benioff and Weiss love to pride themselves on the twists and the subversion. So the GOTchaverse, I feel like it's kind of an apt title for this segment. Moving on from focus character segment. So for this segment, basically what we'll use this for is basically kind of like give people a little bit of a refresher on the different elements and kind of the lore of the entire universe. There's a lot, there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of different families. There's a lot of different cultures. There's a lot of different cities. There's a lot of different locations. There's a lot of different religions, creatures, magic. There's so much stuff that goes into this world.
all right.
And this
Well,
episode,
hit me up, Dom. Tell me something.
So
Tell me one of these things.
So the focus of the GOTchaverse today is the origin of the Starks, the Stark family, in general, and where they reside. They reside in Winterfell, obviously, which again, like I said, is the capital of the North. The North is one of 7 different, 7, technically 8 regions, with how you count like the Riverlands versus the Westerlands. Throughout Westeros, the other ones. So you got the North, the Crownlands, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, the Eyrie, Dorne, the Stormlands, and the Reach. Those are and the Iron Islands, which is kind of like the little bastards, which is kind of like the little that weird uncle that nobody likes having around at family gatherings.
Oh,
as far as the Iron Islands go. Well, I mean, that's how Westeros kind of treats them. House Stark of Winterfell are descendants of the first men, who there were 3 different mass migrations from Essos to Westeros. The first of them being the first men, later followed up by the Andals and the Rhoynar before the Targaryen invasion. They were the first to arrive in Westeros, and they famously brought with them the religion of the old gods. So that being rather than the 7 gods that is kind of like the more like kind of widely accepted religion that is mostly taken up by the Southerners. The Northerners worship the old
so
gods, which
they're like the pilgrims in this story.
Essentially, yes. Like where basically where you'll see the old gods, that's where, basically all the weird trees with the faces carved into them, right? Not much is known about the lineage of the old gods as far as that goes, but basically they're also worshipped kind of by obviously the children of the forest, who were the original inhabitants of Westeros. They were initially founded by Bran the Builder, who was all said to have who was said to have fought against the White Walkers initially during the Age of Heroes, and was said to have taken part in the construction of initially Winterfell and the Wall, as well as having ties to constructions of castles like Storm's End and Hightower. Yeah,
and he's busy, and he doesn't even have a Google Calendar.
Yeah,
like he's just doing it.
Yeah. Obviously, famously, the Wall being the kind of the 9,000-foot tall ice structure that separates the realms of men from the north, and everything that goes on above that. That is famously manned by the Night's Watch, which is kind of like this Ranger-esque, brotherhood that is kind of separate from kind of all the royal families of Westeros. They protect Westeros from the wildlings and other things of such from the north.
Now tell me that wasn't Bran the Builder's idea for the Night's Watch. You cannot.
Well, it definitely feels like
with
it.
Any woman.
Definitely. Yeah, right.
You
are not allowed to lay with a woman. You don't take no wives. You don't father no children.
It's like eyes beyond the wall. That's it.
Yes, that's it.
Fight beyond
eyes
the wall.
north, and that's it, pretty much.
Yeah.
So the Starks rule actually as kings in the north, famously, until the coming of Aegon the Conqueror. The last king in the north was famously Torrhen Stark, who became known as the king who knelt until Robb Stark was crowned king in the north during the War of the Five Kings. As I said, despite the influence of the 7 that was brought by the Andals later on, it's weird because the way that it ended up breaking up, right? Certain of the other northern families that we become introduced to as time goes on are descended from the Andals, but a majority of the Northerners are still descended from the first men, the Starks being one of them. I believe that the Boltons, are descended from the Andals. The Mormonts are the Andals. The Karstarks are the Karstarks, and the Umbers, I know for a fact, are descendants of the first men. And then those are really the only other Northerners that really matter as far as the rest of this goes. Seed is Winterfell, obviously, from which they rule. The sigil, obviously, is the direwolf, which is a wolf that's slightly a couple sizes larger than a regular wolf that resides primarily north of the Wall. And their family sigil, as the title suggests, is Winter is Coming, a reference both to the title of this episode. It's a reference to the coming, the impending doom of the White Walkers, as well as, just the overall general idea that no matter how peaceful things may seem in the moment, there will always be a conflict. So that will be one of many quotes that you will hear as time goes on throughout this show.
Yeah, you'll be hearing them over and over and over.
Over
again.
and over and over and over again.
So Dom, why don't you, let's, now that we got the origin of the Starks out of the way, let's talk about the origin of sort of episode by episode reviews of this TV show. So I sent you over a link for avclub.com and basically this article from April 18th, 2011 from Emily Todd Vanderwerf. And we'll throw this basically in the description at some point. But basically some of the stuff that we've been talking about, I would say is very similar. Like the first 6 episodes are sort of flawed. Maybe some of the, more sort of subtle, like building up, and I would say like this comment is the one that kind of stands out to me the most. Sadly, tonight's pilot, which will likely be the only taste many viewers ever get of this series, is the weakest of the first 6. It's so taking up with the making sure everything is set in place that it largely forgets to do anything other than offer up a long series of stilted introductions. It's smart about only introducing the characters viewers absolutely need to know to proceed in the series. But there are still roughly a dozen of these characters, and even with a 1 hour, 5-minute running time, it's something of a spirit to the cliffhanger ending that actually kicks off the bulk of the story. Oh yeah, sprint. Thank
Yeah.
you for correcting
Yeah,
me.
this is basically continuing. It means that a few of the characters register on a level deeper than, that guy seems cool. There's not a single there's not a single scene here that lays out exactly what the show is going to be and exactly what it and its character's worldwide view is. Not a level of, say, like the lynching scene from the Deadwood pilot or the opening scene from the Wires pilot or even the scene where Don talks about with the waiter about cigarettes and Mad Men. The great dramas often declare themselves somewhere in the pilot, staking out the territory they're going to be playing around in. And while there are numerous cool moments in this pilot, there's not one that reaches beyond the surface and attains the deeper pull of the thematically enriching. So,
Yeah. So,
I
what do you
find
think,
that,
Dom?
I find that really interesting, especially like I said, given that that's kind of a little bit of the sentiments that we were kind of talking about. But the only kind of like interest that as I said before, that I find is kind of again the difference between kind of the people who read the books versus didn't read the books. Because as far as the approach that HBO took to this pilot and by default the show in this season as a greater whole is the idea of not necessarily making this kind of like the story of the week, which obviously they've done in such great fashion before, which again, even the great dramas were still doing to some sense, right? The whole thing of there was still that like that micro story, that beginning, middle, and end of each episode that would eventually build into the next one right up until the pilot. But this one really doesn't, this show ultimately really doesn't do that. Like this show really was, I feel, the first of its kind as far as like this is establishing something that is going to be a part of the whole. And if you really want to get to know these guys more and more, you will have to tune in. We've heard that described about other shows before, but this to me was really the first one that did it, as far as that went. I feel like the only other one that you could...
I think, to be fair, like at the beginning of this article, they do talk about how basically there is sort of this story of the episode versus this whole idea of following multiple threads over time,
Right.
And so I would say, yeah, Game of Thrones sort of definitely goes for the following of the threads. And it's one of those things where like I said at the beginning of the episode, my introduction was I was very sick. I was on the couch. My brother was like, why don't we binge watch this? And when you're sick and you're binge watching what seems to be slow episode after slow episode after slow episode, you're about to tap out and be like, okay, let's watch something else, put something else on.
Yeah.
But there is that shoe that drops in this season, and that's when you sort of get this magical, well, they're showing us everything, but it's for the long game, the long-term payoff. And so, I think it's one of those things where, if you initially, see this pilot episode and you have to write an article like the next, day to have published, and you're basically saying like, it didn't give me any thrills. I tend to agree. Like there's not that many thrills in this episode. I think there's, once you start looking for things and you start talking about the connections and linking the connections, you can start having conversations with other people that have seen this episode. And those conversations are really, I think, what kind of brings up the hype of the show.
Yeah.
Because people are, what's going to happen next? I think this is going to happen. I think that's going to happen. And everybody is sort of thinking about, trying to think 3 moves ahead with how the show is going to present itself and how the show is going to continue. And, I think that's part of the joy that becomes Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a part of the experience. It's definitely kind of, to me, what leads to this show becoming kind of the epicenter of monoculture, kind of that water cooler moment, Joe, that we've talked about a lot at different points throughout the show. Ultimately, is the fact that, again, they have the confidence instilled both kind of in their writers and in their audience that this is going to be a show, ultimately, that people are going to want to come back to, and that this is going to be a show that, despite kind of, maybe some lingering threads that maybe don't necessarily, result in the most fulfilled character experiences, you're still going to want to come back because the ultimate mystery of it all and what results of it ultimately, keeps suckering you in. And that's something that we're going to continue to break down more as we get into each season, as that continues to build and kind of maybe how that ultimately, in a weird way, did end up almost like kind of contributing to it shooting itself in the foot, particularly with those last couple seasons. So before we get out of here, though, Pat, I did want to throw to
what
our
I would
audience.
like to say is, like I said, we're going to put that article link in the description.
Yes.
Take a look at it, read it. If you, disagree, agree, whatever with what I said, Dom said, or the article, like throw it in the comments so we can sort of write you back. And then yeah, let's wrap this up, man. Like
Yeah, let's get some comments in here. So Eric Thorpe has been a big contributor throughout this whole thing, saying best pilot ever. I think so. He also asked, wait, you don't even like season 1, Pat? He didn't actually say that. He didn't actually say that. That's the one thing I will say.
I started seeing like a S1, and I thought for a second it was
that's
Sports
usually what they
Illustrated.
mean when they say right.
I'm sorry. I misread it.
That's funny. That's
like
all good.
my
That's really
for
funny,
for today, my comments are over here, so I'm like looking back and forth.
So you're like looking
between the
back and forth.
cameras.
You're like, what? Oh, don't you just love when that happens? Yeah, Joe Chiruli, hashtag release the Jordan. Can we stop? Can we stop with the cuts, please? I'm sick of it. I'm sick to death of it. All right. Yeah, a lot
I'm sure
of stuff.
he would take the money.
Lot of season 8 stuff overall. Samidi Yamasin commented, said he liked it. I'm glad that you did. J Manley commented, Game of Thrones was the best thing to happen to HBO since The Wire. I'll agree, although I definitely think that Deadwood and a couple of the other shows that happened between then were very slept upon.
Well, The Wire was really good. I think Treme was another good show.
Yes, Treme was one that came. I'm a sucker
Isn't
for
that the
True
same
Blood.
sort of showrunner?
Same showrunner as The Wire. Yeah, that guy did 4 shows for HBO. Treme, The Wire. He just recently wrapped Plot Against America and The Deuce. And there's one other that he did.
Oh, I haven't seen those two. I'll have to check those out.
The Deuce covers the porn industry in New York between the 70s and late 80s. And a plot Against America is basically, it takes place in a fictionalized post-World War II era America where the Nazis won World War II. I find that interesting. Eric Thorpe commented something interesting here, which is where he said that the hate that D&D gets is really silly. Game of Thrones wouldn't exist as the amazing show is overall without them. Couldn't they have done better with the last season? Yes, but they did a great job overall. Yes, I will agree with that, Eric, but the one thing that I'll say in hindsight, and again, hindsight is obviously 2020 and everything, is that I would find that a majority of the criticisms lobbied towards David and Dan were not necessarily with their treatment overall of the show, but mostly kind of with their treatment with the show post, departing the books, obviously. To me, I will definitely say that I was one of the first people, not to toot my own horn, that definitely noticed like a little bit of like a quality drop once they departed from the books. And that started way back in season 5 to me when the show was still pulling directly off the books. Sean Bean was always Ned. He said he liked the GoldenEye reference.
GoldenEye is great.
Great. It's the only good Pierce Brosnan Bond movie.
Yeah, and Sean Bean's going to be the only one to be filmed, having his character die on that particular telescope.
Think about it this way, right? Sean Bean is the only guy Sean Bean is the only guy that can say he's died in James Bond, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, and there's one other big media franchise that he died in that I'm totally drawing a blank on. But yeah, 3 iconic deaths and 3 gigantic media franchises. What's it called? 6 is his personal favorite, and then he would say either 6 or 4. For me, I've gone back and forth. Season 6 has definitely kind of like gone down as far as in my mind, just based on like, again, kind of the post-book era stuff, kind of little problems that I noticed back and forth here or there. I'm a big fan of season 4. I really, really like what they did with that. Gavin Ayot, as it's pronounced, says season 5 has the cold open with the young Cersei. Before Eric Thorpe comments and says, no, actually, believe it or not, I don't believe that was actually a cold open. I just think that was the first scene that we saw in that episode. Yes, the answer, season 6 was fully past the books, but the reason why I bring that up is because season 5, even though it was combining Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, season 5 still was introducing original content that was not previously in the books overall. So those are a majority of our comments overall, and before we get out of here, the only thing that I wanted to leave you guys with is that Pat and I, as we continue to cover this show throughout the next, obviously, couple weeks, and obviously for the rest of this year, obviously, as we continue past season 1 and into the future seasons, is that we will be keeping a death counter. We'll make a graphic for that as time goes on. A little death counter of the amount of people who and beings who die per episode.
Let's explain how this came about.
Yes.
So I basically rewatched the first episode, and a couple days later, Dom and I were having a conversation. I was like, Dom, like one person died in this episode,
and
right?
I'm like, there were 4 people that died in this episode.
Yeah. So he was like, were you even paying attention? And I was like, yeah, I think so. And,
totally, yeah.
then Dom just rattles them off. It's like the guy in the woods at the beginning, and like, oh, I guess extra number one, so
his name was Gareth. Remember, justice for Gareth.
So basically, I can't really, I guess, count. So basically, the whole idea is whatever our final death count is next week after watching episode 2, try to guess what it is. Throw it in the comments, and see who comes closest to it. But just realize, like, we're going to be looking at the screen where anybody that is literally dead on camera, or as I like to say, if they're bleeding, they might as well be dead.
Yep.
We're just going to count them. So try to guess what our final death count is.
And we'll be counting
scientifically.
And even though it's going to be difficult because of the amount of off-screen character kills that happen throughout this show, and there are a lot, we will still be counting those as well. So Stannis Baratheon, Brendan the Blackfish Tully do actually still count, even though their deaths were off screen. So as far as the death count in this episode, we have 4 deaths. We have the 3 Night's Watchmen at the beginning, that being against Sir Waymar Royce, Will, and Gareth. Sir Waymar Royce being executed off screen, Gareth having his head chopped off by the first White Walker that we're introduced to, Will being the Night's Watchman that's executed by Ned south of the wall, and then famously Jon Arryn, who, while we don't see him die on screen, we see his body and the aftermath of his funeral with that weird thing that the Silent Sisters do, where they put the rocks with the eyes on his eyes.
Technically, he's a body, right?
Yes, he is technically a body.
So we can count it.
Yep. So 4 deaths. 4 is the death count in this episode overall. Oh man, this is gonna be really interesting when we get to battle the bastards and we have to like keep track of like all the extras that die, like that get just brutally slaughtered apart. We're just gonna have to be like, yep, and like there's gonna be like so much carnage happening in the background that we won't be able to account for. So that's definitely gonna be an interesting tidbit as far as how the show goes on.
Here's my prediction. When we get to that season, Dom, I feel like you're gonna be John Madden and you're gonna be circling all the different bodies and
I'm gonna have like the little red ticket marks, the way that Kubrick did when he was filming Spartacus and Paths of Glory. That's funny. But
maybe you have a giant abacus on your wall and you're just throwing the bodies on there. I don't know. Anything's possible. It only happens if people want to take a guess in the comments and see what we come up with.
Ultimately, but thank you guys ultimately for tuning in to the first episode of Talkin Thrones. Again, we'll be back next week, obviously, to discuss the second episode of this, that being the King's Road, ultimately. But this was awesome, Pat. I had a great time breaking down this pilot. Again, I love this pilot. I love this show, and I love the fact that I have an excuse to get back into it overall, because I've been looking for an excuse since that god awful last season. Obviously, we're building in a weird way to the next Game of Thrones production that we're getting from HBO, that being House of the Dragon, which is set to premiere sometime in 2022. So this is like kind of a little bit of a subtle build.
Is this sort of like a, Enter the Dragon? There's going to be some more martial arts.
I was waiting. I was waiting for either an Enter the Dragon or a Double Dragon reference. I knew it was going to be one of those two, but
I don't know. I'll take some martial arts in the Game of Thrones world.
Oh man, Game of Thrones and martial arts, man. That what a mix that would be. But ultimately, again, thanks to all the commenters who tuned in for this first stream. Again, there's going to be so many more, and hopefully we're gonna be able to see so many more people in the comments as we go on and continue to discuss this show overall. Thank you to Pat, my famous co-host. Obviously, Pat, where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Hey, listen, I keep threatening to post something on Instagram, just at Patrick W. Huber. One day, I swear, I'll be posting some photos. It's just I gotta figure it out. It's on my phone. I like posting on a desktop. But
it is indeed. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews for my personal, and you can follow us, everything that's going on the Talkin TV channel at Talkin TV Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. If you subscribe to this video and click the bell next to it, you can get notified of every time we put up new content. Just this week, we've got our Kim's Convenience wrap-up podcast that we're going with live tomorrow morning at 11 a.m., so you guys are not going to want to miss that. We've got a little bit of a May 4th special, May the 4th special for Star Wars Day, coming to you guys this week on Tuesday. This Wednesday will be the debut of our Fast and Furious first time watch series, where Chris and I watch the Fast and the Furious for the first time and we break it down. And this coming Friday, we've got something special coming to you guys in order to kind of let's say hold the tide down until the next big Marvel show. But until that time, subscribe to the Talkin TV channel, stay up to date on everything that we've got going on. 12 seasons and a short film, and as always, people, watch for myself and Pat, watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.
Watch more game, man.
Watch Game of Thrones. We'll see you guys next time.